A seminar that I have taught quite a lot and people seem to really enjoy is hand cutting dovetails. Now, most of the time when I do this seminar, I'm talking about through dovetails. So dovetails like this, where the tails and the pins are visible on the opposing sides. But one that always gets questions asked during these seminars is half-blind dovetails. That would be something like these guys, where the tails are buried in a workpiece. In this case, it's the front of a drawer. And from the front, you don't see the dovetail. But on the side, you can see the tails meeting the front piece. So a lot of people ask how you cut these by hand. So I figured I'd show you that today. So let's start off talking about the tools that I'm going to use to do this. So to lay out the dovetails, I'm going to use a marking gauge and a set of dividers. You could use a compass, or quite honestly, you could probably measure them out as well. I just find the dividers work pretty well for me. After I've laid them out, we're going to go ahead and cut them. To do that, I'm going to use a pole saw, and I like to use a little dovetail gauge. This one is the David Barron one. There's a lot of them available, and they all work pretty well, and this is a 1:6 ratio on it. And to remove the waste between the tails, I'll use a coping saw or a fret saw. And to clean everything up, use a series of 2 or 3 chisels. And in addition, mallet, marking knife, and one of my secret weapons for half blinds is going to be a card scraper. Now this is an old card scraper that I had. It still worked perfectly fine, but I've modified it, and I've actually ground a pretty sharp edge on this side, just the front, maybe 1.5 inches. And I wrap some tape around there so I get a good hold and don't cut myself, and we'll see what we use this for in a little bit. So let's start by laying out these dovetails. So I have 2 pieces here. One, the piece of walnut, is a little bit thicker than the opposing piece, which is cherry. So this represents a drawer front and a drawer side. So here, we're going to make our tails roughly in this orientation. And then on the drawer front, we're going to make basically sockets that are going to accept those tails. So the first thing we have to do is we have to mark our workpieces with the thickness of the adjoining workpiece. And I'm going to set this guy so it's just a hair thicker than the workpiece. And it's just a little bit. I'm going to lock that in. Okay, so that designates the thickness of the side. And we need to transfer that to the inside face of the drawer front. Okay, so that's the inside face of the drawer front. So let's go ahead and mark this with the outside. And we'll also mark our side outside, just so we keep everything in the right orientation. And we'll also mark the top side. And usually I just do that by marking an A or a 1 or just a hash mark. So we know outside faces, top edges. So we have that all lined up. So now we need to decide how far we want our tails to go into our drawer front. And usually what I do is I figure about 2/3 of the way. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong. 2/3 seems like it works and it looks good. So I'll just eyeball that. Again, this isn't a terribly critical measurement. So we'll go about there. And we'll lock that in. And now we're going to mark that along the edge of our drawer front. And then we'll also mark that along the 4 sides of our side piece. Make sure you get these knife lines nice and sharp. You want to be able to drop a chisel into them. So if they're really light, it won't register the chisel real well. So go over them a couple times if you have to. Make sure they're in there good. Okay. And that's all we need the marking gauge for. So we'll set that off to the side. So now we've set our distances for everything on here. So now we can go ahead and lay out the tails. Now there's some debate whether you should cut tails or pins first. I always prefer to cut the tails first. I feel like it's easier to mark the matching workpiece if you do the tails first. So let's do those. So we're going to put this guy in the vise with the outside facing me. Grab a spacer to keep this from racking. And when we're laying out tails, we're going to have a couple things to think about. The first is how many tails do you want? My general rule of thumb is for drawers, 2 tails looks pretty good. That's for about a 3 to 4 inch drawer. Any taller, you may want to do more. But usually 2 tails looks pretty good. So when we are cutting these tails, we have some half pins on the 2 sides, and then we have a full pin in the center. And my general rule of thumb is I make the half pin about half the thickness of the workpiece. So this is roughly a 5/8 inch workpiece, maybe close to a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to set this guy about halfway, and then I'm just going to lay the outside leg on the outside edge and push that inside leg in to give me a dot. That's going to designate where my half pin is going to start. And we'll do that on the other side. Okay. And now, I don't usually draw these on, but just so you guys can see this, let's go ahead and draw those lines. Okay. And I found it is always helpful to mark the waist so you are cutting out the correct portion of the joint. So we have half pins here. Now we need to divide this area in the center into 2, technically into 3. So we'll have tail, tail, and a pin in the center. To do that, I'm going to use the dividers again. And I'm going to roughly eyeball about what half is and go a little bit further. And I'm not going to push these in, but I'm just going to walk them across and see where this leg crosses this baseline. And that distance is going to be half of what the pin would be with this adjustment. So instead of marking it there, I'm going to tighten it up a little bit, about right there. And we'll do it one more time. Yep, that looks pretty good. So my pin, so right now I'm about 1/8 of an inch over this line. Double that, my pin will be about 1/4 of an inch on the top, which will be okay for this. So we will put it back in that hole, push it down, put it in the opposite hole, push it down. Okay, so those dovetails are laid out. Now we can cut them. I'm going to do this with this magnetic gauge, and I'm going to set it about on that line. These first cuts on the tails don't really matter where they're at because we'll use this to lay out the rest of the joint. And because the face is towards me, I can see the line that I'm sawing to on this side. So I'll drop the handle down, get right to that line, then I'll come back and drop the kerf down to that baseline on the back side. We'll do that for the rest of these. So now we'll flip this guy around just so I am always pushing the gauge against the workpiece rather than trying to pull it back to me as I saw. Okay, now we will take care of these 2 shoulders. And I'll do that just by putting the workpiece on its edge, staying a little bit away from the baseline, which is right here, and we'll cut straight down. And we're being careful not to go too far on those cuts. And now we will remove the waste from the center. And you can do that either by chopping it with a chisel or sawing it out. I find sawing it out works for me. It's a little bit faster. So we'll drop the blade all the way down, back it up a little bit, start sawing and turn it. And we'll cut across. And once that center section starts to wiggle, I know it's loose, and I'll just come back with my mallet, tap it out of there, break it out. That keeps me from going too far and scarring the edge of the tail. There we go. All right, now we can chop these and clean them up. Okay, so I have my workpiece held down. Now we're ready to clean up the waste that's left next to the baseline we made. And I have this currently inside up, and I'll chop down, flip it over, and chop from the face down. And when I'm chopping here, I like to undercut these shoulders a little bit. It gives me a little bit of wiggle room when I go to assemble the joint, and it keeps anything from being in the way. However, these outside shoulders do need to be square and flat. So I'll start with those guys. I'll drop a chisel into that baseline and use my mallet to kind of fine tune its position, get it right into the corner. And I'll make just a little chopping cut here. Same thing on this shoulder. Okay. Now we'll come to this center waist section. And my goal is always, while I am chopping these dovetails, to use the biggest chisel that I can on the final cut. If there's a lot of waste that I need to remove, I'll use a smaller chisel just because they're easier to sharpen and you can, they're a little bit easier to pound through the waste. But the bigger the chisel, the straighter of an edge you get along that baseline. So this guy looks like this might work in here. And you don't want to remove too much waste at once, otherwise the wedging action of the bevel on the chisel will cause you to go past your baseline, which you don't really want. Okay, so now that I have that shoulder started, I'll come back in with a smaller chisel and slightly undercut this down to about the halfway point through the workpiece. And this undercut's just about 2 degrees, 1 to 2 degrees, just enough to not cause any problems when we go to assemble this. So now, let's flip this over and we'll tackle these shoulders really quick. So on this outside face, I'll do the same thing. I'll tap this shoulder down just a hair. So then I'll flip this on edge, grab a chisel that's wider than the workpiece, drop it in that shoulder line, and we'll chop straight down. The hardest part on dovetails and what causes most people to get hung up is waste in the corners. So you want the corners to be nice and clean and crisp. Make one more slight chop here. There we go. So that corner is nice and clean. and that looks really square. If I had a little bit of waste in the center, I'd come back with a narrower chisel and slightly undercut it, just staying away from the inside-outside faces and that top edge. So just the center section would be undercut. Let's do the other shoulder. All right, again, clean corner, that's what we want. So now just the outside face on the center of that. Okay, now here's an instance where I have a little more waste than I would chop back at that baseline. So I'll come in with a narrow chisel and just knock that waste down to about a 1/16 or a 32nd if you can. And that just removes a little bit of that material that we need. And now we can go to the baseline. Start square, then lean it a couple degrees, and undercut. All right, so we're pretty clean there. I have a little bit of waste in the corners still. So I'll just come in with a big chisel, follow the angle of the tail, push it in, and come back with a small chisel and just get that all out of there. There we go. So that guy's clean. Now we can lay out the sockets on the drawer front. Okay, so we have our drawer face in the vise. I've set it up at the same height as my bench plane. It's completely arbitrary. But what that does is it allows me to take our workpiece that we just cut, rest it on that, and it gives me a pretty good rest. So we will line this up so that the shoulder meets up with the inside face of our front. Our pins are right along that baseline we marked. And now we will grab our marking knife and we will mark each edge of these tails. Okay. And not as bad on half blinds, but on full through dovetails, I always mark this waist because it's very easy as you're working on a bunch of different parts to get yourself confused. So I always mark these on the waist areas. Okay, now we can make our cuts. This is where it's a little bit different than a through dovetail. Because we have this baseline here, we can't cut past that. So really our only option is to make about a 45-degree cut and connect this baseline on the edge with the baseline on that inside face that we marked. So to do that, I'm going to use the dovetail guide again, line up that blade, keeping the blade kerf inside the waist, and start cutting. And I'm watching two lines as I saw here. I'm watching the line on the edge of the workpiece and the line on the inside face. We don't want to cross either of those, but we want to come right up to them. Okay, there we go. We'll do this guy. Okay, now we'll turn the guide around. And with a pull saw like this, you're gonna run into area, at least with this guide, that the back is gonna hit the guide, so you gotta remove it. But at that point, we have a kerf to guide us, and then we're just dropping down to this inside baseline. So right now, those kerfs are basically at a 45-degree angle. So the kerfs are coming right across here. But we need our sockets to be square in the bottom. So, a little trick that I found that I picked up years ago, I'm sure from some magazine or somebody online, is to use a sharpened card scraper. And this is a thin one to match the kerf on that pole saw, but I can get it started in the kerf and then make sure it's tight in the vise. We can just pound it down. Let's get that a little more centered. Okay, so right now I am down to the baseline. So that kerf is pretty much all the way down. Now this can occasionally split the workpiece, especially with something kiln dried like this walnut. Air dried is a little bit better for this. But if it does split it, it's not that big a deal. We can always clamp it back closed, and because the split's gonna follow the grain, it hides itself pretty well. So now that we have those kerf cuts, we can go ahead and waste away the rest of this area in here. Now at home, I've been doing this with a mortising machine. It works really well. But here, I think we'll do that at the drill press. I've set the depth stop fairly shy of the baseline, about a skinny 1/8 of an inch. And that's so the point of the Forstner bit doesn't poke down through the front. Now I've removed most of the waste at the drill press, and I've done that by setting the fence so the bit is just a little shy of the baseline. I want that baseline there still so I can drop the chisel into it, and then we'll chisel down to it. So this is where, in half blinds, it takes a little bit of time because you have some waste to remove. So I start usually by knocking out any of the stuff that likes to chip out right away with the chisel. And I'll work down, and we'll take a couple chops off the stuff left in the corners. And remember, the walls of these guys angle in. So chopping straight down, I'll actually lean the chisel a little bit to try to angle in that corner. This is where a fishtail chisel would be really handy. I don't have one, so I don't worry about it. And like before, keep in mind not to bruise the shoulders. So just watch where your chisel's at. Don't lever against the edges of these sockets or you'll dent them up. We don't want to lever back and forth or up or down. We want to lift up as much as we can. Chop it square, lean it a couple degrees, and go down. And now we'll really start working in those corners, especially since everything here is undercut, at least from the end grains standpoint. We want to clean out all that junk that's in there. And we'll start working this waste down to the baseline. And I'm going to undercut this as well. So first couple taps were square, now I'm slightly undercutting. Just take a second in the corners, make sure those are clean, because those are what will keep that joint from going together in the last, maybe 1/8 of an inch. So we want to make sure those are clean, slightly undercut if necessary. Okay, so now we're pretty much ready to put this joint together. There is one thing I like to do first. I like to hedge my bets and give myself the best chance to get everything together without it splitting. And what that means is I like to come in here with a chisel. Now, these edges are going to be hidden by the side when we put it together. Just the tips are going to be visible. So I'll actually come in about, let's call it 3/16 from the end, and I will start a slight chamfer down to that baseline. And we will do that on all the insides of these pins. So you can see where I have those chamfered, and then we'll just come across the baseline, sever those fibers, get that junk out of there. Okay, and then I'll do the same thing on the inside edges of the tails. Everything on the inside of the tails is actually hidden. Nice little chamfer. And these chamfers make a little bit of room for any of that junk that is left in the corners, and they kind of make the joint start to go together a little bit easier. There we go. So now we can see how it fits. So we'll grab our work pieces, make sure the outside is out, and make sure our top marks are aligned. We'll get those lined up, and we'll start putting them together. Now you can see that's that split from where I drove the card scraper in. So we're going to back that out just a little bit because we want that to close back up, and it closes back up when you pull the workpiece apart. And we're going to pair this shoulder just a little bit, just to keep that from pushing itself apart. I'm going to leave the outside about maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to leave that square, and we'll undercut this inside. And that's just going to give us a little bit of clearance. Okay, so there we go. Now, don't worry if you do a hand-cut dovetail, whether it's through or blind, and it's a little gappy. Quite honestly, they're hand-cut. I like hand-cut dovetails that look hand-cut. If I wanted a machine, I would use a router. A little bit of glue, a little bit of sanding will fill a lot of the gaps that you might have. And quite honestly, one of the beauties about a dovetail joint is that it's a mechanical joint. Because this is the front, this is the side, it's a tight joint as the drawer is getting used. Same way with a case. If the dovetails are in the right orientation, it's a strong mechanical joint. So if they do look a little gappy, don't worry. All you need is a little bit of practice, because of course, practice makes perfect.